It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, Private Investigator Ed Opperman, and you can find me at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting if you email me at oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com. That's the way to get a hold of me. Really excited about our guest today, Arthur Kane. He's a legend over at the Review Journal. He's written a book called The Last Story, The Murder of an Investigative Journalist in Las Vegas. And that's the story of Jeff German. When Jeff German passed away, when he was murdered in cold blood, some people knew I was from Vegas. Everyone said, "Hey, Ed, did you know Jeff German?" I never met Jeff German, but he was a legend in Las Vegas. And in his honor, Arthur Kane has written a book about him, The Last Story, The Murder of an Investigative Journalist in Las Vegas. You can meet Arthur Kane in person at Barnes & Noble in Las Vegas at 2191 North Rainbow, May 7th at 7 p.m. Mr. Arthur Kane, are you there?
I am here.
Thank you so much, my friend. Before we get into the story about The Last Story, the murder of an investigative journalist in Las Vegas, tell about yourself. Who is Arthur Kane?
I am a longtime investigative journalist in print and broadcast. Spent a few years in TV myself. I've been a reporter at newspapers like the Denver Post, Des Moines Register, some other ones for years. And currently I'm investigations editor at the Las Vegas Review Journal, where I have a team of 4 investigative reporters who uncover graft corruption and waste of taxpayers' resources. I've been doing that type of work for years myself, have won a Peabody, a couple of DuPont Columbia Awards, and some other major national awards for my investigative reporting, and was named in Journalist of the Year in 2020 and 2022. Feel like I have some experience in this, and I decided to write this book about my colleague and friend, Jeff German, who was murdered in 2022 by what police say is a public official who was upset about his reporting.
And I can testify that Mr. Arthur Kane's a very patient man, very forgiving man, because I was late today with the interview, and he was very kind to forgive me and then proceed ahead. Now, you say your specialty is corruption. You must be, is there corruption in Las Vegas? My goodness, is there gambling in this town as well? What goes on in Las Vegas?
There is quite a bit of government corruption everywhere, but in Las Vegas it has been the last 5 or 6 years when I was a reporter before I became editor. There was a lot of things I exposed that turned into kind of forced people to law enforcement to indict some people, and Jeff and I did a long project that ended up with 5 people being indicted for theft at the Las Vegas Convention and Visitors Bureau. And did some stories about the dental board. The governor ended up removing half the dental board, and the 2 top executives of the board were fired. So there's a lot of problems, and I feel like it's our duty, and the First Amendment of the Constitution gives us the responsibility to expose those so that the taxpayers are not injured. And so that's what I've basically done with my life.
There you go. You can read more about Arthur Kane at the Wild Blue Press. They got a little blog for him over there. And also, too, at the Review Journal has a page for him as well. So tell us about Jeff German. How did you meet Jeff German?
Well, Jeff was, and he pronounced it German, so I'm going to pronounce it the way he did, but it is spelled German. He was a court reporter at the Review Journal when right before I was hired, and the paper was taken over by a wealthy family and bought by a wealthy family, and they decided to form an investigative unit and put some money into that. And so he was moved from courts to be the first person on the investigative unit, and I was hired soon afterwards as the first outside hire for the investigative unit. And so we worked pretty closely. Like I said, that first story started when I was researching this book. I realized that we put in the records request for that first story about the Las Vegas Convention and Visitors Bureau the week I was hired. So we started working together. It was a story idea that he had, and that I had kind of jumped onto with him, and so we worked pretty closely. We did 5 or 6 big investigations, and on top of the stories we did individually, and I don't know that we would call ourselves close friends. I'd never been to his house before he had been killed, and he'd never been to mine, but we definitely were close colleagues who worked together for a good 6 years and did some pretty top-of-the-line investigative reporting.
Yeah, and especially nowadays, you can be so close to somebody and never go to their house with the internet and phone calls and stuff. Everybody's got a phone in their hand. Why don't we do this in reverse a little bit? How did we lose Jeff German?
On the Friday before Labor Day, 2022, he walked out of his house. We don't know why. Went to the gate in his backyard, and an assailant jumped out and stabbed him 7 times in the neck and torso. He collapsed, probably died instantly. His carotid artery was severed in the assault. He collapsed and was behind a bush and wasn't found by a neighbor until almost exactly a day afterwards. So he was found the morning of the 3rd. And it was at the beginning, it was a kind of a whodunit because police first thought it was maybe some sort of a love gone bad, and then they thought maybe he had surprised a burglar. There was video of the attack because his neighbor across the street had cameras that they were probably the size that you would see in casinos, big bulb cameras, and so once they found his body, they started putting out press conferences showing video of the assailant. He was dressed in a way that it wasn't identifiable who he was. He looked like a road worker with a big sun hat and stuff like that. It was still pretty hot when it happened, in over 100, I think 10 degrees when the day that he was killed. And then by Wednesday, they had released Tuesday, they had released a picture of the truck that he was driving, and someone recognized that truck and called or texted police.
And initially, there was a lot of speculation that it was organized crime. It had to be organized crime because he was such a crime buster reporter.
Well, I mean, a lot of the mob stuff has kind of moved out of Vegas and been kind of replaced by the corporations and stuff like that. So we probably didn't think it was organized crime just because they'd been gone for 2 or 3 decades by the time that he was killed. There was some discussion on what he was writing about. He had spent some time writing about, right-wing militias and groups like that. So there was some speculation there. Obviously, he had just written a story about a guy named Rob Tejas or Tellis. So he has 2 pronunciations of that name, but I think it's Tejas is the one that he uses most often. He was a county public administrator who was alleged to have been an abusive boss and also having an affair with a subordinate. So that was the last story Jeff wrote, and that story ended up helping that guy lose his reelection bid. But there were other people that he had made mad with his reporting. So if the police weren't right about it being a surprising a burglar, then there was a potential that some of those people could have been involved in some way or shape or form.
And this Tejas fellow has turned out to be quite the odd character. I believe, is he currently representing himself?
No, he finally, I guess we should bring the audience who doesn't know. So that Wednesday after the truck was released, somebody in Rob Tejas' office, where he was public administrator at Clark County, called police and said, hey, that his wife has the exact same truck, and they arrested him and charged him, and he was indicted eventually for murdering Jeff. And prosecutors and police say that he did it because he was upset at the stories, and Jeff was actually getting more information about his communications with a woman that he allegedly was having an affair with. And he was actually notified the day before the murder by the county that they were going to release some records after the Labor Day weekend to Jeff. So basically, he went to 3 or 4 attorneys, represented himself for a long time, but then a couple of months ago hired a pretty high-profile criminal defense attorney here named Drastovich, who is taking over the case, which is supposed to go in August.
But it appears to be open and shut, too, as well, so we'll see what happens there. a lot of my audience as well, when people think of Las Vegas, one of the big topics that comes up is the October 1st shooting. Were you guys involved in investigating that?
Oh yeah, that was all hands on deck. That was the highest or the worst mass shooting in the history of the United States, with 60 people who died, 58 on the scene, and 2 eventually died of their injuries months or years later. So I think the toll that they say is 60. Yeah, we were scrambling. It was obviously all the national media was in town. Jeff actually broke a huge story that ended up being picked up by a lot of national media that the shooter was trying to shoot at the fuel tanks across the street at the airport because he wanted an explosion that would draw people away from the airport and closer to the Mandalay where he was shooting from. But he didn't realize that jet fuel will not explode because of a round. You need to have open fire to get jet fuel to or a spark, right? And so there were holes in the fuel tank, but he never was able to accomplish that explosion. So that ended up being probably one of the biggest scoops the paper had, and Jeff got that from his sources, which were important to him.
Yeah, and if you didn't live in Las Vegas at the time, like the highways were shut down that night. There was the whole town was like in chaos. The highways were shut down. I couldn't take my kid to school the next day. And then later on that week, there was a threat at the school, a copycat type threat at the school. We had to keep her home again. But the average person out there will talk about that story and say, well, it was never solved. Well, there's no motive. What kind of conclusions did you guys come to?
My conclusion is that the shooter specifically made it to make sure that no one knew why he did it, because he was trying to screw with people's minds. And so he was successful in that he wiped all of his devices and left no record of why he would do that. And I don't know that we'll ever know, because he never talked to anybody about it. He never wrote a manifesto like people are. It's a very strange situation in that most mass shooters are young men in their teens and 20s, and this is and usually broke and have nothing going for their lives. And this was a wealthy, high roller guy who was playing $125 a hand video poker, and so it's a really, like everything in Vegas, it's a strange case.
Yeah, he also had a lawsuit against the casinos because he was like awake for 19 hours straight at those poker tournaments, and I guess it triggered his depression or some kind of mental illness. Yeah,
I mean, there's a lot of factors in play at that. I mean, he was an interesting character, and it's unfortunate what happened, and it's unfortunate that the families will never even know why. I mean, that's probably adding to the to their pain, just to know why their family members were killed or injured in that. But unfortunately, that's the world we live in now, where this kind of stuff can happen.
Yeah, and talking about the world we live in now, I guess it wasn't that bad then. But at the time, this Laura Loomer comes out with this bizarre theory of the Saudi Arabians and helicopters and all this stuff, man. Which now, with there's so many conspiracy, wild theories you see all over the internet and TikTok and stuff like that. But that's kind of tragic in itself, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, there's always... especially when government isn't wholly accountable or transparent, it gives you a opportunity to have these kind of rumors out of there. And so what Jeff and I do with our lives is try to document and as much as possible verify and get information out so that you get the truth as opposed to the rumors. But yeah, I mean, there's always going to be people who are interested in the Kennedy assassination and wherever else, that will either make things up or misinterpret things or maybe find things.
Yeah, it's just so terrifying now that these people are just elevated into these superstardom, and people can just overlook these kind of bizarre fantasies they have. Now, what about Arthur Kane? Arthur Kane, you see your good friend Jeff German murdered. And how does that due to his journalism? And you're a journalist. Right. You're doing the same exact thing he is. Does that send a chill down your spine? How did you react to that?
Well, I mean, you always think about it. In fact, Jeff had asked me if I wanted to do this story with him, and I said, well, I was fortunately or unfortunately in the middle of an investigation of a captain in Nye County who was doing a lot of really questionable things, and so I kind of begged off. So I don't know what would have happened if he and I had done the story together. But another word, I mean, philosophically, the way I think about it, and, when I'm trying to hire people do ask me, is it dangerous? I think it's kind of like walking outside and getting hit by a meteor. It's just something that happened, something that is unfortunate, but it's not hopefully typical of what it is. It's just a set of circumstances where if police and prosecutors are right that this guy did it, he was just a certain type of personality who decided to go off and lose it and get revenge. And so obviously, do I take precautions? Yeah, but you can't go around being afraid of that meteor. I mean, you can't live your life, hiding in the basement because maybe a meteor will hit you. So you got to go and do what it is and take whatever precautions and react appropriately and go from there.
What about some like the really, really notorious stories of Las Vegas, like Binion? I was going to say Ted Bundy, but Ted Binion, the Ted Binion murder and Sandy Murphy and all that. You guys cover that stuff?
I didn't. I've only been here for 6 years, but Jeff actually wrote a book about it, about that case because he covered the trial. It's called, it was, I think, if I remember right, in 2000, he published a book about the case and what happened with that. But yeah, it was a strange case. It was, at first police didn't even think it was a murder until the family and some private detective who actually, ironically, there's a nexus between that case and this case because the private detective who worked for the Binion family to try to get police to prosecute the suspect in that case was the same person who contacted Jeff about this because his daughter worked at the public administrator's office. And so Tom Dillard, who is a former Metro detective and was a private investigator, has a connection to both cases.
Yeah, he was offered a $1 million bounty to get Sandy Murphy arrested and convicted. What a town. A small town, too. Vegas is really a small town. People really think, they think, 30 million visitors. But the people that actually live there, it's a small town. Most people know. I remember I did a show about one night about Frank Collada. I interviewed Frank Collada. Mm-hmm. Right. And the next day, my daughter had a basketball tournament. And I was telling people, one woman was an FBI agent. I was like, oh, yeah, talking to Frank Collada. I said, every single person there had a personal story about Frank Collada. They all knew him or had some kind of connection to him. The guy must have been everywhere. Yeah.
Yeah, those were definitely people that Jeff kept tabs on. There's an anecdote in the book about him and another reporter going to the bar that was owned by Spilatro, who was working, who was one of the mob people who was with Frank Collada and trying to get an interview with him on Christmas Eve, and him saying basically no, but buying them some drinks. So they had a lot of close interpersonal contact with some pretty dangerous people, and for Jeff to be murdered, not in that situation, but years and afterwards, there's some irony there.
Yeah, it really is, and you see that sometimes in the movies. It's some like wannabe guy who winds up taking down really a hero like Jeff Garman. What about you had mentioned these corruption cases that you guys had worked on at the dental board?
Well, I did the story on the dental board. Jeff and I worked on the Las Vegas Convention and Visitors Bureau, which is actually a government agency. Most places it's a nonprofit that promotes the city, but here it's a county agency. The head of the agency some years made $1 million a year in taxpayer money, and to promote the city. They're the ones who came up, or they hired the firm that came up with the slogan, "What happens here stays here," And so we, early on, Jeff had been hearing that there's a lot of waste and mismanagement there, and so we looked into their receipts and found hundreds of thousands of dollars spent on alcohol. We found I think an $8,000 steak dinner for 8 people. with bottles of wine. We found, them going to clubs and buying themselves Tiffany jewelry on the taxpayer's dime. And that story, oh, God, that was a 2.5-year story by the time it was over. Eventually, they did an audit and found out that the head of the agency, who was making $1 million a year, was stealing Southwest gift cards so he could fly his family around. These cards were bought by taxpayers to give to people bringing conventions into the city. Instead, he pocketed them and ended up pleading no contest to a misdemeanor, and initially he was charged with a bunch of felonies, but the DA gave him a break and let him plead to a misdemeanor, and his career was pretty much ended at that point. But he was a really powerful mover and shaker in the city, because that agency has a lot of what they call juice, or a lot of clout. Because it's the board of directors of that agency is half elected officials and half casino people. So, and they were flying the elected officials to Asia, first business class or first class, and putting them up the nicest hotels so that they wouldn't ask them any questions. And it was quite the questionable den of corruption that Jeff and I basically exposed and got reforms in it. So that was my introduction to Vegas. That was the first story I did when I got here.
You must have made a lot of friends then, right? Showed up in town.
You don't make a lot of friends in this business. My joke is when someone's upset, I said, line forms to the left.
Yeah.
As long as I'm accurate, that's the only thing I care about, is being fair and accurate. But if making friends in the political circles is not something I'm really interested in. I'm not one of these people who wants access to the governor or something like that. I don't need that. I need access to public records and data that I can expose what really is going on.
All right, great. Let's make some more enemies then. Okay, I'm safe. I'm down in Florida now. I'm safe. We got Arthur Kane still over there on the hot seat. The author of The Last Story, The Murder of an Investigative Journalist in Las Vegas. You can find it in Wild Blue Press. You can find it's on Amazon, of course, and you can meet Arthur Kane in person at Barnes & Noble. I want to give him a tip or something, too. Barnes & Noble in Las Vegas, 2191 North Rainbow, May 7th, 7 p.m. Well, let's back up a bit to October 1st again, because that Victims' Compensation Fund was run by Steve Sisolak, the former governor. Did you guys look into any kind of corruption or mismanagement in that fund?
There have been rumors around. I don't know that we've been able to uncover anything that is I would call corruption or not. I mean, I think people should keep an eye on it. I did not personally look. I don't think either I nor Jeff really looked at it in detail, but so no, I guess no. Maybe it's something I can assign one of my reporters now to look at if we have a better information about it. But I don't think anything was really proven about any kind of problems with that. Yeah,
just the usual complaints, I guess. What about now? There was a big scandal about the airport, the way the airport was being run too, as well.
Yeah, I mean, that just got renamed basically for Harry Reid, which was a bit of a controversy. And, there's every once in a while things pop up. I did a story about county officials using their parking cards where they're supposed to park there for official business. They were using them to go on vacation and get the free parking. I just came back from a trip to Chicago, and I know car parking is not cheap there. I think 3 days cost $54. So it was kind of a bit of a benefit that they weren't supposed to take. So, but there's always, it's you started out by saying Vegas is a small town, but there's over 1 million people in the area, and there's a lot of government. There's a lot of that government will take advantage sometimes when they can.
Yeah, and just an Uber ride from Henderson to the airport is like $50-$60 too. So yeah, it's just a joke. What about police? After leaving Las Vegas, and to quote a movie, I don't want to get into that, but I moved to Las Vegas, and I start getting pulled over all the time by the cops in Las Vegas, and I just got used to it. I'm gone now. I never get pulled over. Like Vegas being like your car registration, the stickers expired. You're pulled over that same day, man. They got you right there. Cops are everywhere. Now, do you guys cover any kind of abuses with the police and these police shootings and deaths, like Eric Scott and this Byron Williams "I Can't Breathe" case? You guys cover any of that stuff?
Yeah, we did. I did an investigation right around the time that all those things, looking at discipline at the police department, the big police departments in the area, and I found, which is unfortunately kind of typical of a lot of police departments, is that there will be complaints by people, repeated complaints against one specific officer or another, and nothing's done about it. And we were able to document. Henderson actually released a trove of records in response to our records request, showing that there are 5 or 6 or maybe a dozen people who've had repeated, pretty substantial complaints, who not only haven't been fired but were promoted through the system. And you can find that story at the RJ. It's still up there. It's a project with video and stuff like that. And but what's frustrating about it is you spend 6-8 months on a project like that, and then nothing really happens. I mean, then one of my reporters continued to find stuff in Henderson with problems in the department and the lack of discipline of people who may not be qualified or shouldn't be police officers. And so that's one of the more frustrating things, because obviously if we expose something, a lot of times things will change. But when it comes to police, a lot of times it won't. And it's concerning, because you're right. They have the power to pull you over. They can shoot you. They can do other things. They can take away your freedom. And so they really need to be held accountable more than pretty much any other agency. And a lot of times, because of the culture there, they're not. Yeah.
And the George Gomez case. And that other one, too, where the fellow who was actually a police supporter shot his gun into the BLM protest, but then they tried to make it look like he was pro-BLM and he was a shooting against the police. Is the press complicit with that in Vegas, you think? The news, the TV news? I know that I'm not accusing Arthur Kane, of course.
I think it's a difficult thing to get at, because the police refuse to release the actual investigative records of the officers and their complaints. There's a citizens review board, and they do some things, but I think the biggest problem is that the police unions have been able to basically cow the administrations into not firing a lot of these people, and cow the legislature into not acting in a way that would reform the system. And I mean, a lot of these public workers unions are very powerful, and they've been able to get themselves a lot of benefits and salaries and pensions on the taxpayers' dime, and and then also thwart accountability. And so it's kind of a double-edged sword about that.
I'm getting depressed. I don't know about you.
Sorry. Welcome to my world.
I know, man. I know. I've left Vegas. I left Vegas about 2019. So that's pretty much about the same time you showed up, I guess, and started working at the Review Journal, at least. What about the corruption at the family court system in Las Vegas? You cover that?
That is such Jeff that was one thing that Jeff would always say. It's just such a web there that it's almost impossible, because you've got emotions on both sides, and you're dealing with people's kids, and so it's almost impossible to sort through that in any systematic way. We get allegations once a week of someone saying the judge was biased against us, and then you look at the case, and all of a sudden you realize, well, this person was abusing the kid or left them in the house, and stuff like that. So we haven't really dug into that, and I don't know how you could do it in a systematic, fair way, because it's just such a heated situation. Police say the most dangerous calls to them are domestic calls, right? Because of the emotion, and I think that's the same for a family court.
Oh yeah, there was just a murder down in Summerlin, right? A couple of attorneys, and they had at a deposition. The attorney shot his daughter-in-law, son-in-law, and their attorney, daughter-in-law, I think it was. Yeah.
He shot his ex, or his son's ex-wife, and her new husband, who was a prominent attorney representing his ex-wife in this domestic case. So yeah, that was I didn't get involved in that story because there wasn't much to investigate. It was pretty clear cut what happened, but our newsroom definitely was all hands on deck on that one because it was really high profile people, really well known people were involved and shot and in the shooting and being shot. So that's always a strange situation.
And then you talk about how you look into these cases and you find out, well, the parent was involved in abusing his own kids. In Vegas, we have cases where the judge is involved in abusing their own kid. We had a judge there. This guy had like 5 girlfriends. He had them all arrested for domestic violence, one after another. And just what a town, man. I tell you, look, I miss it. I miss Vegas so much, man. But just what a town, you know?
It's definitely a big news town, and definitely Jeff basically chronicled everything from when he got here in '78 till his death. So 40 years of corruption and malfeasance was, either uncovered or written about by Jeff in those times. And in the book, I talk a lot about that, about what he was writing about and what he was doing and what his interesting conflicts with politicians and also with other media people, which I thought was really fascinating.
Oh, like who?
Well, he had this ongoing feud to his death with John Ralston.
Oh, so do I, man. So do I. Tell us that. I'll tell you a story about this, but go ahead, tell us.
So basically, I never really got to exactly why it happened, but basically they were not at each other's throats on TV programs, and they would go after each other. They would go after each other in their columns. I was really, I've been a journalist long enough to have some dislike of certain competitors, but it never really went out to anything past bar talk, right? But these were, Jeff wrote columns about Ralston, and Ralston slammed him in an interview he did for the New Times and by name, and in fact, at the end, which I think was probably the most inappropriate thing, Ralston runs this nonprofit website called the Nevada Indy. The editor at that site put out a memo saying that Jeff wasn't much of a journalist at all after he was killed, and that obviously upset a lot of people, including his friends, and was pretty inappropriate. In fact, the whole Indy staff kind of revolted against the person, and she had to walk it back. But it's a rough and tumble town. It's definitely the Wild West, and it's definitely bare knuckles here. So I think it makes for a compelling story and narrative of what he faced. Like I said, I did this for 25 years before I came here, in places like Denver and other places, and we never had anything even close to that kind of vitriol in the public,
I wish I would have known. I would have packed up Jeff in the car. We would have went over there to handle things the old-fashioned way. What about any coverage of especially thinking back to the caucus with Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton, the corruption that went on, the flying chair. That's what Ralston did, the flying chair. He saw flying chairs at the caucus. That's what pissed me off about Ralston originally. Did you guys do any reporting on that?
No, I didn't, because I'm not sure Jeff was involved. I mostly focused on kind of his interactions with Jeff and their sniping at each other. Right. But I don't know that Jeff was involved in the caucus was here, and I know we all covered it, but we didn't. It was pretty we weren't that important of a state, at that point, especially in the Democratic thing. So it wasn't a huge story for us at that point. But there's definitely, I think it's been documented fairly well that the Democrats wanted to kind of, lay a path that didn't involve Bernie Sanders. Yeah. But
it was just short of a hole in the desert. You know what I mean? Now, so what was his big break for Jeff Garman?
I think, I don't know that, obviously I think the highlight of his career was writing that book about Binion, but I think he basically just came here right out of college. He graduated from Marquette in 1977, and got a master's degree, and knew a woman who he had done some freelance for in Milwaukee, was out at the Las Vegas Sun, and they were looking for reporters. And so she said, "Why don't you apply?" And he applied, and came here and had a little bit of a slow start, but then ramped up and became pretty well known, and was kind of the go-to guy in the Sun for a while until he got laid off in 2010, which is probably the low point of his career. I talk about how he actually was crying once they told him that he was no longer a reporter, because that was pretty much his whole life. And then, fortunately for him and us, he a few months later was hired by the Review Journal, with a paper that he hated for years and years, ironically, but then grew to love after they hired him and gave him some opportunities. And so, they put him on the investigative team, and the rest is history. He kind of, spent 6 years doing what he loved to do before he was killed.
Was there anything he was working on behind the scenes that you can clue us in on? Something he was, he always wanted to break but couldn't?
No, I mean, he always wanted to talk about, he always wanted the corruption and digging into whatever agency he could get his hands on. I mean, I think it's interesting that the day before he was killed, the county told the suspect in the murder that they were going to release documents about his communications with this woman who there's videotape of him in the backseat of a SUV with this subordinate, both of whom were married to other people.
Yeah.
And so the interesting thing about that is, as soon as he was killed, the county decided not to release that, saying that was part of the investigation or that was personal. And so, I assume that those will come out in the trial in August, and I'm interested to see what those internal messaging things that they were going to release to Jeff actually say, because I don't know how damaging they are. But clearly, if you're in the back of an SUV with someone who's not your wife, you have some answering to do to your wife.
Yeah, but on top of that, there was all kind of crazy allegations. This guy's behavior at that office was crazy. And
right.
There was just all kind of allegations. But now, is that standard practice for the county to notify this administrator that, hey, we're releasing documents about you to this investigative reporter? Is that standard?
Unfortunately, it is.
Really?
Unfortunately, it is, because their claim is that, they want to make sure that the person, if there's something damaging, that they have a chance to talk to their spouse before it's in the paper. And so, and it happens all the time. We see, you get open records that actually have the emails saying, okay, we're going to release these open records to Art Kane or Jeff Gehrman or something like that. So we kind of know that this is happening, right? And a lot of times the PR people will look at the records beforehand, or the lawyers will, and so because they want to know what they're going to have to respond to. So yeah, it is actually typical. I don't know how appropriate it is, considering that this is stuff done on a taxpayer-funded computer, right? So yeah. It's really the business of the taxpayers of what's released, but apparently most agencies do that, and it's another benefit for the people, for the public officials.
We're talking about like the risks you take, as an investigative reporter, God forbid some guy's going to show up at your house with a knife and start stabbing you. But what about the more subtle things? Like even Ralston, he had that DUI arrest, and like the cops pulling you over, a little subtle harassment and stuff like that. Does that kind of stuff concern you?
I will tell you, I do not even have one or two drinks and drive. I always take the Uber. I mean, yeah. I mean, I have on my way home. There's every if I go out play poker late at night and I come back home, there's a gauntlet of people being pulled over on my path home. So I'm always very careful about making sure everything I do is on the right side of the law. Yeah, I mean, you always worry about it. I mean, in the book, I detail at least two other violent incidents that happened, Jeff. One time he was punched by a court employee who was also at the time a bagman for the sheriff and for a guy who was doing loan sharking for the mob. And then he got into a shoving match with the with a top lawmaker in Carson about something that I never figured out what it was, what the story was about, what he did, but I was able to confirm that, sure enough, they got into a tussle at a bar. And so those were just the physical things. And then there's all these incidents where people would call him out in print, whether it's Ralston or the Attorney General called him a small, little, bitter man, and Jeff had to respond in a UPI story, and Jeff had to respond that he's glad that the Attorney General is reading his column and that he's not small. So there was it was definitely in the 70s and 80s. It was rough and tumble. It apparently still is, and it's a unique place. I tell people that Vegas is one of the characters in the book, right? I mean, it's really the whole history and the circumstances and just the attitude of the place that Jeff worked is different than I think most other places in the United States.
Now, who was the sheriff that who was the sheriff that had a problem?
Oh my God, that was so long ago. That was in the 80s. It was Bill. I forget who it was.
I know who you're talking about.
This guy was collecting campaign contributions for the sheriff at the same time that he was collecting, enforcing for this loan shark for the mob. And then at the same time, he was a bailiff in the court system. The guy was obviously had his fingers in a lot of different jobs. He was hardworking, but he basically Jeff's car and his house was getting vandalized, and Jeff saw him at a party, like a retirement party, and told him to call off his dogs, and the guy just threw a drink in his face and punched him. And there's some the funny thing about that is the police officer who came to take the report was also hated Jeff because Jeff was writing about the shooting that the officer was involved in. In fact, the shooting was portrayed in the casino. Definitely inaccurately, it was portrayed in casino, but it was a pretty high-profile shooting, and so this cop was involved in lawsuits about that shooting. At the same time, he was taking this report, and Jeff kind of said, "Oh my God, I can't catch a break. I get punched in the face, and then the guy who's taking a report has it out for me too." So it's just the way Vegas is and was.
Yeah, especially back in those days, like you said, they used to have these, they called them clip joints, these little strip joints that the cab driver would take you over there, and you go in, and you go back into this other room, you're going to get something in this other room, another $100 in this other room. Then when you start complaining, they would beat the crap out of you, throw you out of the parking lot, and the same cab driver would pick you up. And this is going on night after night after night. Oh, my God.
Yeah, I mean, I think things like that still happen because a friend of mine was at a bachelor party where they tried to give him a $10,000 tab, which he did get beat up, but he definitely Vegas is very good at separating the money, the tourists from their money. Yeah, that's for sure.
That's actually on my. I jotted down Crazy Horse. Did you guys cover that whole scandal with the Crazy Horse and the guys getting beat up out in front of there, and then the FBI raids? I think the Department of Justice was running the place for a while. It's just crazy.
Yeah, that was well before my time. Right. I think Jeff wrote a few things about it, but I wasn't. I came here in December of 2016, so
gotcha.
That was well over with by the time that had happened.
Yeah, just in time to see Bernie get screwed.
Still controversies with him.
Now, was Jeff the kind of guy to get punched in the face? Was he the kind of guy that could take a punch and scrap it up with these guys?
Well, I mean, he didn't fight back. I mean,
no?
he was a fairly thin, and I think he was 5'11" or something like that. But I mean, obviously, you don't want to get involved with someone the guy who punched him was an ex-boxer and a former New York cop. I think probably he was outmatched. And luckily, it happened in the Sands hotel, and luckily the security was right there and separated them. But and Jeff didn't even bother to press charges on it. But what was interesting about that situation is that I found a series of columns he wrote after he was punched about being punched. He ended up getting an internal FBI document about the guy who punched him and was able to report all of his activities weeks after. One of his columns as I'm recovering from my interaction with Cy Friedman, I think that was the name of the guy. I've got this police report that details some of his loan sharking actions and it goes and continues, is not cowed by the fact that he was attacked. Basically, just continues to report and expose what this guy is doing and questioning why this guy has a government job and why he's working for the sheriff. And so he was not one to be. He may not fight back physically, but he was not one to be cowed by the attacks like that.
Yeah, gotcha. What about, we don't have that mob influence like there once was, but we do have the corporate casinos, and they got a lot of money, Do you witness them trying to exert their influence over the news and the press?
I'm sure they do. I mean, I think that they probably, like I said earlier, the fact that they basically ran this agency called the Las Vegas Convention Bureau, because half of them were there deciding what to do with taxpayer money on that board. Of course, the company that, when it's a company town like this, there's definitely exertions. I've never had, and I don't cover casinos, right? I was mostly government, but I've never had anybody call me up or tell me not to write something because the casino is powerful, and that would be the worst thing possible. I've written stuff that is adjacent to casinos, and those stories came out, but I'm sure they tried to exert themselves. They got the money. Those casinos were not built on losers, right? I mean, if you've been into any of those big casinos on the Strip, they're pretty impressive monuments that were very expensive to build. So we definitely have, some power players there that could try to influence it. But hopefully the journalists here are independent enough not to take that bait.
Now, what about, we just had a thing over there with this computer hacking thing, right? Now, that wasn't nationwide. It was slightly nationwide news, but that was a big, big, big deal, man. What do you know about that? What can you tell us about that?
Basically, these hackers got into the Caesar system, and they got into the MGM system and locked up the computers for days. And my wife was actually staying at the Strip with a friend of hers, just enjoying the pool for a little bit of staycation, and she was in the middle of it. Luckily, it didn't sound like it was too bad for her because she doesn't gamble. But anybody who was trying to cash out a ticket at one point, you had to go find somebody. You couldn't use the machine to cash out your $500 win at the slots, and so it was a big deal. I think it's been reported that the Caesars had paid these guys off, and MGM won, so they ended up causing a lot of problems for them.
Yeah, just fascinating, man. And didn't make nationwide news hardly at all. Just a whisper of it. And what I understand, they had clipboards with paper reservations. They were checking people in.
Yeah, they had
by hand.
They had top managers walking around with pockets full of cash trying to pay out winners. I mean, it was we've had some stories since of how much this cost them in business, and it was not good. But everybody's, and the way they did it was so crazy, right? They just found a guy whose name they looked up and got enough personal information that they acted like he had lost. They acted like he was an employee of MGM who lost his password and just called IT, and they gave him his password or reset his password for him, right? And so that it wasn't any major sophisticated thing.
Yeah.
They just targeted an employee, got his date of birth and some other things where they could verify if the IT person asked, and that's how they got in the system. And my God, that's scary, right?
Yeah, well, that happens. That kind of stuff happens.
Yeah.
What about, remember that case with that Cuban guy? He was like a stick-up guy, and then he escaped from the jail. Did Jeff cover that story?
No, I don't think he did. I think I read a book. You mean the guy who was robbing
casinos,
the, armored cars?
Yeah.
The armored cars from the casinos. Yeah, I don't think Jeff actually had that story. I think I read a book about it before I moved to Vegas. But
gotcha.
That was an interesting case.
Yeah, I tried to get that guy on the show. Yeah. Okay, we're talking to Arthur Kane. The book is The Last Story, The Murder of an Investigative Journalist in Las Vegas. Wild Blue Press puts it out. You can get it on Amazon.com. He's got a bio, too, on the Review Journal there. You can meet him in person at Barnes & Noble, 2191 North Rainbow, May 7th at 7 p.m. Now, what is in the last story that I haven't asked you about that you want the audience to know about? We've only got a few minutes left.
I think one of the big things is the year-long fight that we had with the police and prosecutors to try to protect Jeff's sources. So after he was killed, they took his cell phone, 4 computers, and a hard drive out of his house, and we had to go to court to block them from looking at it because it had a bunch of his, it had 40 years of confidential sources, some of whom probably worked at the police department and the prosecutor's office. So that was a interesting thing in that, you know, it really looked at that point. We didn't want to obviously interfere with the criminal case, but we also weren't going to let any of Jeff's sources be exposed after he had promised them to confidentiality. So huge legal fight. We ended up at the Nevada Supreme Court, which sided with us and said that the sources, the shield law pertains to the reporter after he dies and the news organization that can exert it. So now the newspaper is actually looking through all those devices, including myself and 11 other people, and trying to find out what's privileged and what the prosecutors, police, and Rob Tejas as attorney can look at. And so that ended up being a huge precedent-setting lawsuit and cost us a lot of money, but it was well worth it just because if you can't protect your sources, no one's going to come to you and tell you stuff, and we can't do our jobs without people coming in and telling us about corruption and waste and things that we need to write about. So that was really an important thing that kind of came out of all this, is that ruling in November by the Nevada Supreme Court.
Oh, yeah, that's crazy huge, because just imagine, he could have investigations there of the actual cops that are investigating the murder. You know what I mean? Total conflict. Yeah. Oh, my goodness. Okay, yeah. Arthur Kane, thank you so much, my friend. Again, I apologize for the delay and all the problems today. The last story, The Murder of an Investigative Journalist in Las Vegas. You can find it at Amazon. It's published by Wild Blue Press. You want to meet him in person? Get your book signed. Barnes & Noble, 2191 North Rainbow, May 7th, 7 p.m. Mr. Arthur Kane, thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
Good night.